History remembers Martin Van Buren as the little magician, the cunning architect who invented the modern political machine and pulled the strings of Washington for decades. He was the master of the deal, the king of the backroom, a man who valued loyalty above all else. But his greatest loyalty wasn't to a party or a country, it was to a ghost. After his wife died, he never remarried. He never even spoke her name again. He conquered the presidency entirely alone, proving that sometimes the most powerful man in the room is the one with nothing left to lose. The Hudson River Valley in the winter of 1782 was a place of mist and silence, a landscape that seemed to belong more to the folklore of the old world than the rugged frontier of the new. Here in the sleepy village of Kinderhook, just 20 miles south of Albany, a child was born who would embody one of the greatest paradoxes in American history. Martin Van Buren arrived on December 5th, 1782. Technically speaking, he was the first president to be born a citizen of the United States, not a British subject like Washington or Adams or Jefferson, but a true son of the Revolution. Yet if you had stood over his cradle or listened to the lullabies his mother hummed, you would not have heard a single word of English. Kinderhook was a Dutch enclave, a bubble of the Netherlands preserved in amber within the chaos of the newly formed America. The people here did not look to Boston or Philadelphia for their culture. They looked to their ancestors who had settled the region in the 1600s. They attended the Dutch Reformed Church, they ate hearty Dutch meals, and they spoke a dialect of Dutch that was already becoming archaic back in Europe. For young Martin, English was a foreign tongue, a language he would have to learn in school like a second-class citizen in his own country. A struggle that would leave him with a guttural accent that he would fight to suppress for the rest of his life. His father, Abraham Van Buren, was a patriot who had served in the Revolution. But in peacetime, he was a tavern keeper and a farmer. The Van Buren Tavern was the center of Martin's universe. It was not the hallowed halls of Harvard that shaped him, but the smoky tap room where politicians, lawyers, and travelers stopped on the post road between New York City and Albany. Here a young Martin, small for his age and listening from the shadows, learned his first lessons in human nature. He watched men like Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton debate and maneuver. He learned that politics was not just about high ideals, it was about handshake deals, whispered secrets, and the ability to read a room before you even open your mouth. But there was another anchor in this small, insulated world, a presence that was as constant as the river itself. Hannah Hose. Hannah, or Janetje, as she was known in the intimacy of their Dutch community, was born just 3 months after Martin, in March of 1783. She was not a stranger from a distant city. She was family, his first cousin. They grew up in the same tight-knit clan, sat on the same hard wooden pews in the village church, and ran through the same fields along the Hudson. In a community where outsiders were viewed with suspicion, Martin and Hannah were two halves of the same whole. They shared a language that the outside world could not understand, a private code of Dutch phrases and cultural touchstones that created a wall around them. To the rest of the world, Martin Van Buren was becoming a sharp young lawyer, a man on the rise who was quickly realizing that his lack of formal education and his funny accent meant he had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. He was developing the thick skin and the cunning that would one day earn him the nickname, the Little Magician. But to Hannah, he was just Martin, the boy from the tavern. She saw the vulnerability behind the ambition. She understood the insecurity of the boy who had to translate his thoughts from Dutch to English before he spoke. Their courtship was not a dramatic romance of letters and grand gestures. It was a quiet inevitability. It was the deepening of a bond that had existed since birth. When Martin left Kinderhook to study law in New York City, he entered a world of dazzling wealth and vicious politics, a world where he was mocked for his rough clothes and his rural background. But he carried the memory of Hannah like a talisman. She was the reminder of who he truly was before the masks, before the deals, before the power. In February of 1807, Martin returned to the Hudson Valley. He drove a sleigh over the frozen winter roads to the village of Catskill, where Hannah was staying with her sister. There, in the front parlor of a simple house, amidst the snow and the silence of the countryside, they were married. He was 24, she was 23. It was a union of absolute simplicity. There were no reporters, no political allies, just two people from the same small Dutch village, promising to face the coming storm together. Hannah was described by those who knew her as a woman of gentle disposition, modest, pious, and utterly devoted. She was the blue-eyed calm to Martin's frenetic energy. She did not crave the spotlight. She did not want to be a first lady. She simply wanted to be the wife of the man she had known since they were children in leading strings. As they began their life together in Hudson and later in Albany, as Martin began his rapid ascent up the slippery ladder of New York politics, Hannah remained his sanctuary. In a life that would become increasingly defined by betrayal, alliances, and the cold calculus of votes, she was the one true thing. The only person with whom he could speak his mother tongue and drop the guard of the politician. They were building a family. 4 sons would follow. And for a brief golden decade, the little magician had something more powerful than magic. He had a home. But in the tragic theater of the 19th century, such happiness was often a loan, not a gift. And the debt was coming due sooner than either of them could imagine. February 21st, 1807. The snow lay deep on the ground in the village of Catskill, but inside the parlor where Martin Van Buren stood across from Hannah Hose, the world was warm. They were married in a ceremony that was characteristic of their entire life together. Private, modest, and deeply rooted in the traditions of their Dutch ancestors. There was no pomp, no fanfare, just the joining of two lives that had been intertwined since childhood. For Martin, this day marked the beginning of a relentless ascent. He was 24 years old, a lawyer with a sharp mind and an even sharper ambition. He moved his new bride to the bustling town of Hudson, just a few miles down the river from their sleepy birthplace of Kinderhook. Here the little magician began to practice his tricks. He threw himself into the rough-and-tumble world of New York politics. He was appointed surrogate of Columbia County. He fought legal battles during the day and argued political theory in taverns late into the night. He was building the foundation of a machine that would eventually run the entire country. But while Martin was conquering the courts, Hannah was building something far more important. She was building a sanctuary. In the early 19th century, the role of a political wife was a silent one, and Hannah Hose Van Buren played it to perfection. She was not a socialite who craved the attention of the press. She was not a Dolly Madison, hosting lavish parties and charming diplomats. Hannah was a woman of the hearth. She made their home an island of Dutch comfort in an increasingly English world. When Martin returned home, exhausted from the noise and the treachery of his public life, he stepped into a world where the language was familiar, where the food was hearty, and where he was not a politician, but a husband, and soon a father. The years between 1807 and 1817 were a whirlwind of life. The Van Buren household filled rapidly with the sounds of children. Abraham arrived first in 1807, followed by John in 1810, then Martin Jr. in 1812, and finally Smith Thompson in 1817. For a man like Martin, who viewed legacy as everything, these sons were his pride. They were the proof that the Van Buren name would endure, that the tavern keeper's son had established a dynasty. But in the 1800s, death was a constant visitor in every nursery, no matter how wealthy or powerful the father might be. The joy of their growing family was punctuated by moments of shattering silence. Hannah gave birth to a daughter, a little girl who would have been the softness in a house full of boys. But she was born still, or died so shortly after birth that history barely records her existence. Then came Winfield Scott Van Buren, born in 1814. He was named after a hero of the War of 1812, a strong name for a strong future. But he died in infancy, taking a piece of Hannah's heart with him. These losses are the invisible scars of history. Biographers often gloss over them as statistics. Infant mortality was high, they say, and move on. But for Hannah and Martin, these were not statistics. These were tiny graves dug into the hard earth of upstate New York. It was Hannah who sat by the cradles, watching the fever take her children. It was Hannah who had to wash the small clothes and pack them away. And it was Hannah who had to dry her tears and welcome her husband home from Albany, hiding her grief so as not to burden the rising statesman. This shared sorrow created a bond between them that was unbreakable. Martin saw the quiet strength in his wife. He saw how she endured, and it anchored him. As his career skyrocketed, becoming a state senator in 1812, then the Attorney General of New York in 1815, he relied on her stability more and more. They moved to Albany, the state capital, a city of mud and ambition. Here, Hannah found herself the wife of one of the most powerful men in the state, but she refused to change. She joined the local Presbyterian church. She spent her days caring for the poor and the sick, often ignoring her own fragile health to help others. She was the Janitja of Kinderhook, even in the governor's mansion. She created a world where the boys spoke Dutch at the dinner table and where the Bible was read every evening. It was a golden era, a time of 12 years of happiness, as Martin would later describe it. He was winning every political battle he fought. His sons were growing into intelligent young men, and he had the love of the only woman he had ever wanted. But looking back, we can see the storm clouds gathering. The frantic pace of Martin's career meant he was often absent, leaving Hannah to manage the household and the heartbreaks alone. And beneath her gentle smile, her own body was beginning to fail. The harsh winters, the frequent pregnancies, and the silent weight of grief were taking their toll. The little magician could manipulate votes, he could charm juries, and he could outwit his enemies. But he was about to learn that there are some forces in this world that no amount of political genius can control. The clock was ticking on their time together, and the silence of the Hudson Valley was waiting to reclaim its daughter. The winter of 1819 in Albany was merciless. The wind whipped off the Hudson River like a wet lash, turning the streets into tunnels of gray ice. But inside the Van Buren home, the cold was nothing compared to the silence that was settling in. The White Plague had come. Tuberculosis, the silent assassin of the 19th century. It didn't care that Martin Van Buren was the Attorney General of New York. It didn't care that he was the most brilliant legal mind of his generation. It simply wanted his wife. For months, Martin watched the woman who had been his compass since childhood fade away. Hannah Hose Van Buren, the robust girl who had run through the fields of Kinderhook, was reduced to a shadow, her breath coming in shallow, racking gasps that echoed through the house at night. The doctors came with their grim faces and useless tonics, but there was no bargaining with consumption. For a man like Martin, a man who believed that every problem had a solution, every conflict had a compromise, this was a torture beyond words. He was the little magician. He could pull political victories out of thin air, but he could not pull the air back into his wife's lungs. On February 5th, 1819, just weeks before her 36th birthday, Hannah died. The light of the Dutch sanctuary went out. Martin stood by her bedside, a widower at 36, with 4 young sons pulling at his coat, looking up at him in terror. In that moment, the political animal died, and only the broken man remained. Now here is where the story usually goes one of two ways. In the 19th century, a man in Martin's position was expected to move on, and quickly. He was young, he was wealthy, he was powerful, and he had a house full of motherless children who desperately needed care. Society dictated that he should find a new wife, a partner to help him climb the ladder to Washington, a hostess to run his parlor. The widows and debutantes of New York society were already lining up, whispering about the eligible senator. It would have been the practical thing to do, the political thing to do. But Martin Van Buren did something that shocked them all. He closed the door. He didn't look for a new wife. He didn't court. He didn't even entertain the idea. He made a silent vow, a covenant as binding as any law he had ever argued in court. Hannah was not just his first love. She was his only love. When they lowered her into the frozen ground of the Kinderhook cemetery, he buried his heart with her. This wasn't a temporary period of mourning. This was a life sentence. For the next 43 years, Martin Van Buren walked the halls of power alone. He went to the Senate alone. He went to the State Department alone. He walked into the White House as the President of the United States alone. He became the most powerful man on earth, but he never let another woman sit in Hannah's chair, and his silence was absolute. Years later, when he wrote his autobiography, a massive tome of nearly 800 pages where he detailed every political battle, every alliance, every enemy, do you know how many pages he dedicated to Hannah? Not one. He didn't even write her name. Some historians have called this coldness. They say he erased her. But look closer. This wasn't the silence of indifference. It was the silence of a wound that refuses to heal. It was a grief so profound, so sacred, that he refused to cheapen it with ink and paper. He couldn't speak her name because it hurt too much to say it. The little magician had a trick that no one understood. He could shake hands with 1,000 people, smile for the cameras, and run a country while carrying a ghost in his pocket every single day. He became the ultimate political operator, the fox, the red fox of Kinderhook. People feared his cunning. They said he had no principles, no soul, but they were wrong. His soul was safe. It was just buried in upstate New York under a modest headstone that read simply, Hannah. He raised his 4 sons with a fierce devotion, playing the role of both father and mother, checking their lessons, nursing them through fevers, and teaching them the values of their Dutch heritage. He never let them forget who she was, but for himself he chose solitude. In a city built on partnerships and power couples, Martin Van Buren remained a party of one. It is a staggering testament to the power of loyalty. We think of politicians as men who will sell anything for a vote, but Martin Van Buren proved that there was one thing that was not for sale: his past. He conquered the world, but he never tried to replace his home. So when you look at the portrait of the 8th president, with his wild white sideburns and his shrewd, calculating eyes, don't just see the politician. See the man who stopped loving the day the music died in 1819. See the man who proved that you can lead a nation, you can change history, you can live for another half a century, but you can never truly leave the girl from your hometown. Washington, D.C. in 1829 was not run by the Constitution, it was run by the drawing rooms. And the gatekeepers of these rooms were not the senators or the generals, but their wives. When Andrew Jackson rode into town as the new president, he brought with him a hurricane of populism. But he also brought a problem, a social nuclear bomb named Peggy Eaton. Peggy was the wife of the Secretary of War. She was beautiful, she was outspoken, and according to the whispers of the Washington elite, she was loose. The society ladies, led by the haughty wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, declared war. They drew a line in the sand. No decent woman would visit Peggy Eaton. No decent woman would invite her to tea. She was to be shunned, erased. This was known as the Petticoat Affair, and it sounds like a trivial high school drama. But in the 19th century, this was a constitutional crisis. President Jackson was furious. He was a man who had killed people in duels for insulting his own late wife. He took the attacks on Peggy Eaton as a personal declaration of war against his administration. He roared at his cabinet members, demanding they force their wives to socialize with Peggy. But here's the problem with power. You can order a general to march into cannon fire, but you cannot order a Southern belle to drink tea with a woman she despises. The government was paralyzed. Cabinet meetings turned into shouting matches. The vice president, John C. Calhoun, was helpless. He couldn't control his wife's social calendar without destroying his own marriage. The entire administration was on the brink of collapse because of a social boycott. Enter Martin Van Buren. The Secretary of State watched this chaos from the sidelines with his heavy-lidded eyes. He saw the anger of the president. He saw the helplessness of his rivals. And he realized that he held the most powerful card in the deck. He was alone. Because Hannah was gone, because he had refused to remarry, there was no Mrs. Van Buren to tell him who he could or could not talk to. There was no wife to worry about social standing or tea party etiquette. He was a free agent in a city of henpecked men. The little magician made his move. It was calculated, it was brilliant, and it was devastatingly simple. While the other men looked at the floor when Peggy entered the room, Martin stood up. He offered her his arm. He escorted her to dinner. He sat beside her at state functions. He organized parties and made sure Peggy was the guest of honor. He treated the scandalous woman like a queen. To the society ladies, it was social suicide. But to Andrew Jackson, it was the ultimate act of loyalty. Jackson looked at Van Buren, and he didn't see a slippery politician anymore. He saw a man who stood by him when everyone else fled. He saw a man who respected the president's wishes over the petty gossip of the aristocracy. The bond was sealed. In the evenings, while the other cabinet members went home to argue with their wives, Martin and Jackson would go horseback riding together or sit by the fire drinking whiskey, plotting the future of the nation. The Petticoat Affair destroyed John C. Calhoun. He had been the heir apparent to the presidency, but his inability to manage the scandal turned Jackson against him forever. And who was there to pick up the crown? The widower from Kinderhook. Van Buren eventually engineered a masterstroke. He resigned from the cabinet, a move that allowed Jackson to fire the entire rest of the cabinet, purging Calhoun's supporters, and start fresh. It was a political sacrifice that cemented his place as Jackson's chosen successor. It is a strange and twisted irony. If Hannah Van Buren had lived, she likely would have joined the boycott against Peggy Eaton. She was a pious woman of the church. She would have followed the social norms, and Martin would have been just another trapped husband, unable to side with the president. But her absence left a space that Martin filled with ambition. Her death had broken his heart, but on the ruthless chessboard of Washington, D.C., it freed his hands. The ghost of Hannah Van Buren didn't just haunt him. In a way, she cleared his path to the White House. He rode to the pinnacle of American power, not on the strength of his policies, but on the advantage of his solitude. March 4th, 1837. Martin Van Buren achieved the dream. He stood on the east portico of the Capitol and took the oath of office as the 8th President of the United States. He had climbed from a tavern floor in Kinderhook to the highest peak of American power. But as he walked into the White House that evening, the triumph must have tasted like ash. The mansion was silent. There was no wife to greet him, no partner to squeeze his hand and whisper congratulations. For the first time in the history of the Republic, the White House had no first lady. For the first 18 months of his presidency, the executive mansion felt less like a home and more like a high-end bachelor pad run by a workaholic. The social calendar, which is the lifeblood of Washington politics, ground to a halt. There were no elaborate dinners, no charming tea parties to soothe the egos of angry congressmen. It was a stag administration, men in black coats talking about tariffs and banking until the candles burned low. The atmosphere was grim, serious, and devoid of the feminine grace that the capital had grown accustomed to under Dolly Madison or Louisa Adams. Van Buren realized he had a problem. He was the little magician, but you cannot perform magic in an empty theater. He needed a hostess. He needed someone to soften his image, to make the White House sparkle again. But he would not marry. That door was locked forever. So in a move that seemed perfect on paper but would prove disastrous in practice, he turned to the next generation. His eldest son, Abraham, had recently married a woman named Angelica Singleton. She was the daughter of a wealthy South Carolina planter and a distant relative of Dolly Madison herself. She was young, beautiful, educated, and possessed an impeccable pedigree. She seemed like the perfect solution, a surrogate first lady who could bring style back to the presidency without threatening Martin's vow of solitude. In 1839, Angelica swept into the White House, and suddenly the gloom vanished. But it was replaced by something far more dangerous. Angelica and Abraham had just returned from a grand tour of Europe. They had visited the courts of England and France. They had dined with kings and queens. And Angelica, young and impressionable, had fallen in love not just with her husband, but with the pomp and circumstance of the old world aristocracy. She looked at the rough and tumble democracy of America and decided it needed a makeover, a royal makeover. When she took over the social duties at the White House, she didn't just host parties, she held court. She began to receive guests in the Blue Room, not standing at eye level like a Republican citizen, but seated on a raised platform like a queen on a throne. She wore purple velvet gowns, the color of royalty, adorned with ostrich feathers and heavy jewelry. She stood in tableau vivant, living pictures, posing like a statue for the admiration of the guests. It was a display of elegance that would have been applauded in Paris or London. But this was not Paris, and the timing could not have been worse. While Angelica was playing queen in the Blue Room, the country outside the White House gates was collapsing. The Panic of 1837 had triggered the worst economic depression in American history up to that point. Banks were failing, businesses were shuttering, and tens of thousands of men were out of work. In the streets of New York and Philadelphia, people were starving. There were bread riots. The mood of the nation was ugly, desperate, and angry. Imagine the optical disaster. On one side of the wall, you have the common man struggling to feed his children. On the other side, you have the president's daughter-in-law sitting on a velvet platform, dripping in diamonds, mimicking the very European monarchs that America had fought a revolution to escape. It was political suicide wrapped in silk. The opposition party, the Whigs, watched this spectacle with glee. They seized on Angelica's behavior and weaponized it against Van Buren. They painted the president not as the son of a tavern keeper, but as King Martin, a decadent dandy who ate from gold spoons and drank expensive French wine while the people starved. A congressman named Charles Ogle delivered a famous speech in the House, spending 3 days describing in lavish, exaggerated detail the luxury of the Van Buren White House. He mocked the royal heirs of the administration. It didn't matter that Van Buren himself was actually frugal. It didn't matter that the gold spoons were from the Monroe administration. The image stuck. Angelica's attempt to bring class to the White House had backfired spectacularly. She had tried to elevate the presidency, but she ended up alienating the people. For Van Buren, the irony was bitter. He had remained true to his dead wife. He had brought in Angelica to help him navigate the social waters, to fill the void Hannah had left. But instead of an asset, she became a symbol of everything the voters hated. The little magician had pulled a rabbit out of a hat, but the rabbit was wearing a crown, and the hungry wolves of American democracy were waiting to tear them both apart. The lesson was brutal. In America, you can be powerful, you can be rich, but you must never, ever act like you are better than the people who put you there. July 24th, 1862. The Civil War was tearing the nation apart. But in the quiet village of Kinderhook, the old man's breathing finally slowed to a stop. Martin Van Buren died in the house he had built on the soil where he was born. The circle was closed. He had been the president, the secretary of state, the architect of the modern political machine. But in his final instructions, he didn't ask for a grand monument in Washington. He didn't ask to be buried among the titans of history. He simply asked to go home, to the small cemetery behind the Dutch Reformed Church. They laid him to rest beneath a simple granite obelisk. And there, after 43 years of silence, the long winter finally ended. He was placed next to Hannah. The wait was over. History remembers him as the Red Fox, the man of 1,000 faces, the politician who could spin any lie. But look at that grave, and you will see the truth. Martin Van Buren deceived his enemies. He manipulated the voters, and he outsmarted the system. But in the end, he never deceived his own heart. The little magician's greatest trick wasn't becoming president. It was proving that in a world of shifting alliances, love is the only thing that remains forever. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, like and share to support me. See you in the next video. Have a good day.